I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Help us welcome former pastor, sustainable communities organizer, eco-theologian, and pro-science evangelist MichaelBDowd. Reverend Dowd is one of the most prolific and inspiring thought leaders alive today. He and his wife Connie generously guide, steward, teach, and spread a reality-based theology that is deeply grounded in earth. Please welcome Reverend MichaelBDowd.
Okay.
And you can hear me fine?
I can hear you just great. You're in good shape. Visual's good, and the sound is good, and
Sweet.
And life is good.
Life is good. It's, the amazing thing is, as you've probably experienced more than 99.9% of the population as well, it's like being present to the final years of Homo colossus, quite possibly the final years of Homo sapiens, certainly possibly the final decades of Homo sapiens, has not, once you move through the whatever grief and anger or frustration or whatever, and occasionally dip back down into those when certain news realities come to fore. But for me, I don't usually lose the passion and love and majesty of life and the gratefulness to be alive at this fucking amazing time in human earth history.
Yeah.
So I actually have as much or more joy in life as I've ever had, and yet I'm present to the most sobering stuff imaginable, which is the catastrophic loss of life in the sixth great extinction that will probably, or at least quite possibly, include us. And yet trust in evolution, trust in ecology, trust in life, trust in the process, trust in reality, which for me is synonymous with faith in God. So really quite interesting.
Well, that's as good a place as any to start.
Okay, great.
Those words were just uttered by MichaelBDowd. And Michael, I don't know if I've ever told you the story that I had done plenty of video work and some local television work and so on a few years ago, when I had seen your online, thank you, your online symposium that you put together at more than 50 different thought leaders from around the world. Just an extraordinary offering to humanity, and grossly underseen and underappreciated, I might add, as is most of your work. And I'd like to get a new kind of orientation to, I'm sure, the layer upon layer of new work that you've got. But because of my exposure to your symposium, and not only the content, but just the generosity of it, the scale of it, the quality of it, that's what really turned me toward the iteration of my work as it's become. Is you got me on that path because I saw that it can be done really well, and the tools now that used to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for a production facility and so on, here's a man who's putting this together and with extraordinary quality. So MichaelBDowd, welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast.
Great, thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. And just full disclosure, you and I are talking right now because you reminded me of your presence and what you're up to just a few days ago when you signed up for what's starting up this week for me is a 6-session series of Saturday classes, brief Saturday classes meant to be sort of an introduction or a springboard into full engagement with what a term that's been coined in the past year or two by Jem Bendell called deep adaptation. And I am just so honored that you decided to participate in that series with me and with us. I'm expecting it to be just an ecstatic set of classes for me. You know, I'm in it. I'm in it as much for my own value as anyone else. And I just couldn't be more thrilled at how it's turning out, and particularly that you have come to join us. And I think we're overdue for checking in, because we both know, you and I, that that things are accelerating. Things that you and I, and those folks that you were talking with in that symposium a while back, we've all been aware of the collapse of Earth and human systems, the apparent acceleration year after year, nonlinear acceleration, intensification. And so I'm looking forward to how you are evolving in these times, how you're engaging in these times. And you and your lovely wife have been so engaged, not only in this informational and sort of broadcast realism aspect of the work that you do, but something that I've actually been watching out of the corner of my eye. I've never been a religious person. I've been starved for a religious presence, someone who knows what they're doing in that domain, that holds the earth and the stewardship of earth and of life in a container similar to yours. So I'm, for that, probably more than any other reason, I'm very, very excited to be talking with you, because you've been at that a while. I would love it if you would recount some of the cornerstone pieces you put in place around that, like the new 10 Commandments and so on. So let me stop talking. You know I'm excited to be talking with you. Is there anything particularly that I've said, any direction that you'd like to go just straight out of the gate? And please just welcome and go where you'd like to go.
Well, thanks, Dean. You actually laid out about a half a dozen things that I could go down any one of those paths and really enjoy it. A few things. First of all, I appreciate you for the generosity of sentiment, what you just expressed. Yeah, for those who aren't familiar with my work, my wife, Connie Barlow, is a science writer, a climate activist, especially focusing now on assisting trees in migrating north because of how rapidly climate is changing. She's one of the leading point people in North America in this field of assisted migration, is what it's called. And she's also an editor. She's a audio, text, and video editor. So pretty much everything that I produce goes through her before it goes out to the world, which is quite a blessing. We have now lived on the road, literally without a home and without an apartment, for 17 years. Actually, we celebrated our 17th anniversary just last week. And what we've been doing is traveling North America, speaking in churches, colleges, universities, environmental centers, what have you. Essentially where science, inspiration, and sustainability intersect. That's our passion. And Thomas Berry was a mentor for both of us for many, many years. He died in 2009. But he lost faith in me in the last years of his life because I had become a techno-optimist. In the year 2000, I read several books that put me on more of a techno-optimist bandwagon, which I now see was a form of denial of our ecological predicament.
Yeah.
And so understandably and rightfully, he lost faith in me in that he saw me on a path that he couldn't endorse. It wasn't really the universe story, the epic of evolution, what's sometimes called big history, which I now incorporate green history or environmental history into big history. has always been what I've been passionate and really evangelistic. I've been sharing in the good news of this epic of evolution, this universe story. But as I mentioned, I really became enamored with some of the techno-optimist vision in 2000, and really for 12 years, from 2000 to 2012, I had a much more linear understanding of evolution, a linear understanding of human history, and I sort of ignored the deeply ecological challenges, environmental challenges, peak oil as well, and climate change and other things, even though I was involved passionately in the 1980s and 90s in deep ecology and bioregionalism and sustainability and that sort of thing. So, we've spoken into like 2,700 groups over the course of the last 17 years, literally from atheist to evangelicals and everything in between. And for the first 12 years, or actually for the first 7 years, mostly what we did is everything we created, text, audio, video, we put up on our main website, which is thegreatstory.org. And we were always trying to live mythically. So we were trying to basically give away as much as possible, not charge for anything, because the way we supported ourselves was traveling and speaking and selling a book, a table of books and DVDs at the back of the room afterwards. I wrote a book in 2006 called Thank God for Evolution. It did quite well. It was very well endorsed. 6 Nobel Prize winning scientists, as well as about 100 religious leaders across the spectrum. And then a big publisher, Viking Penguin, picked it up and published it in 2008. And that opened a lot of doors, really standing on the shoulders. These weren't my ideas. Some of them were, but they really weren't just my ideas. I was standing on the shoulders of thousands of scholars, scientists, environmentalists, ecologists, who were really bringing together inspiration and soul nourishment, to use religious language, and our best evidential, fact-based, scientific, global collective intelligence about the nature of our inner reality, our outer reality, our social reality, and our interpretive reality. And so there's just tons of stuff on the Great Story website. Connie actually discovered literally yesterday, I got an email from one of my closest, oldest male friends who said, "Hey, Michael, what about that Evolutionize Your Life stuff that you and Connie did back in 2011? Is that available anywhere?" And I thought to myself, well, I think some of it is. And so I searched and I sent Connie an email, and she literally spent the entire day yesterday collecting, like in old hard drives and stuff, all of this amazing material called, we did a course, an online course called Evolutionize Your Life, which was all about right relationship to our instincts, our physical instincts, our social instincts, our interpretive instincts, and our sort of deep relational, or what gets called spiritual instincts. And I had forgotten that we had done so much work, and she had too. So we just uploaded this literally yesterday to the website. So if you just go to thegreatstory.org and then just click on where you see a little yellow box toward the bottom, Evolutionize Your Life, just click that, and boom, you've got access to all of it. And it's all freely available. The series you mentioned was really, it came out of the sort of come to Jesus moment, climate come to Jesus moment, meaning coming home to reality moment, in 2012. In December of 2012, we had our climate change awakening. I woke up before Connie. I watched David Roberts' TED Talk, Climate Change is Simple. I was brought to tears. I woke Connie up. We both watched it. We were both in tears. And that afternoon, we ordered about a half a dozen books, including James Hansen's Storms of My Grandchildren, Bill McKibben's Earth, Al Gore's The Future, Paul Gilding's The Great Disruption, and several others. And climate change went from being a back burner issue to a front burner issue in a major way. And so then that was December 2012. Throughout 2013, I ended up studying, 20, 30, 40 hours a week studying climate change and various deep sustainability, and now would include deep adaptation in that. And then we realized in 2013 that there was planning to be a march where Ed Fallon, a former politician in Iowa, was organizing this march called the Great March for Climate Action, where 50 marchers marched from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. They began in March of 2014 and ended up in New York, in Washington, D.C. on November of 2014. So Connie and I decided to let that structure our entire year. So we were often a week or two ahead of the marchers, sometimes a week or two behind the marchers. I was usually marching with them into the big cities with my, clergy stuff on, and I was often speaking at the climate rallies. And so during that time, that walk across, I mean, we didn't walk a lot, we were usually driving, but supporting the Great March for Climate Action, I also interviewed 56 of the world's top experts. I mean, literally the cream of the crop on climate and deep sustainability, and a sprinkling of spiritual leaders that help us hold this scary stuff without just freaking out. And that was called The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. And again, if you go to thegreatstory.org, our main website, and just click on The Future is Calling Us to Greatness, you'll see it under video series. But I have also on SoundCloud, I now have all the audios that can be downloaded. So the audios, all those 56 interviews on audio and also on video are available. And again, they're all freely available, and they're just amazing. These are really stunning interviews. Some of them brought me to tears. And then, of course, the work that you've been doing, and Carolyn Baker and others who have really been sort of older brother, sister on this path of really accepting what's real, working through whatever grief we need to work through, and then being of service to our communities, being of service to the future, being of service to the planet, whether our species survives this bottleneck or not, basically. And that's why I was so thrilled to see, this latest offering that begins in a few days in terms of working with Jem Bendell and the whole deep adaptation folks. And I just created, in fact, I want to mention this because this is probably the most helpful for anybody watching or listening to this conversation. This is probably the most helpful resource that I've created, is up on my SoundCloud account. I have a playlist called 8 RIP, that's rest in peace, RIP Homo Colossus. And I have 35 or 36 audio files. Jem Bendell, about half a dozen or more from him, and interactions between him and Jeremy Lent. I've got Catherine Ingram, Dar Jamel, and Barbara Cecil. I just got the best of the best in terms of how to really stay present to the inevitability of social collapse and the inevitability of really the extinction of Homo Colossus, which is this wasteful, industrial, anti-future form of humanity. William Catton was the one that coined that, Homo Colossus. And the likelihood of catastrophe, or likelihood of massive problems as a result of that collapse, and the possibility of extinction. All of those are real. And so how to stay present to that and move through whatever grief you need to move through so that you can be of service and that you can have the best quality of life and the best, healthiest relationships and really joy of living, even in the midst of really scary stuff. And I find that being at peace with your mortality and our mortality, each of us being at peace with our own mortality and our species' mortality, and ultimately putting our faith in that which is larger than us. And whether you call that God or the goddess or nature or the universe or reality, it doesn't matter what the name is, but it's got to include the living, pulsing presence of the biosphere as divine. The biosphere, the ecosphere is divine. The cosmos is divine. If you want to imagine a God that's also transcendent and supernatural, fine, whatever. But you got to include the cosmos and the ecosphere in whatever your notion of the divine. Otherwise, you have a trivial notion of God and a desacralized notion of what's primary reality, which is the soil, the forest, the life upon which we depend. Right. So anyway, looking forward to participation in this project that you're doing with Jem Bendell. Looking forward not to being a teacher in that, just contributing with the others. But you have been now for several years and continue to be just a close colleague in this movement, and for that I'm grateful.
Well, thank you. And there's one last thing, if you wouldn't mind. You are easily the most prolific producer of important content in this whole field that I'm aware of. And there's one piece that I think you left out that I'd appreciate if you'd spend just a little time speaking about, and that is your, I actually don't know what you call it, but for me, it's that you have offered a translation of faith, a translation of a relationship with the divine that instead of being based in some sort of scripture or book or tradition, that what I've experienced when reading it, watching it, listening to your content about that, you really orient my attention toward what is it to consider that the scripture is actually being present to life in this miraculous web of life. The
Yeah, thank you.
experience of that. And so if you could speak to that, and perhaps, a little bit of something about the new 10 Commandments, whatever you'd like to share about that part of your work.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for reminding me to speak about that, because it is central to my life and my legacy work. A few things. One is that when you understand the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion, like what role has religion played in the history of our species? Well, it turns out for the first 97, 98%, 99%, depending upon whether you start humanity at Homo habilis 2.5 million years ago, or whether you start humanity at Homo sapiens, say 400,000 years ago. That's the difference between the 97 to 99% of our history. But for the first vast majority of our history, religion or lifeways played the essential role of ensuring that the culture was accountable to the future. That's the essence of sustainability, is being accountable to the future, being faithful to the future. The essence of unsustainability is being unaccountable to the future, being unfaithful to the future. And it turns out that no institution can do that other than religion or lifeways. That is, those who were responsible for interpreting our relationship to reality and creating the exercises, the rituals, the taboos, the whatever, that literally forced the culture to be accountable to the future, because our instincts, unchecked, can do damage. So our instincts need to be held, contained, constrained, checked, so that we are a blessing to the future rather than harmful to the future. And it's the role of religion to do that. And the scholar that has done more to further this core understanding is Edward Goldsmith, Teddy Goldsmith. His nickname was Teddy, but his name was Edward Goldsmith. He was the publisher and the editor of The Ecologist magazine for like 38 years before he died. And he wrote one of the best-selling environmental books of all time, like 750 or 800,000 copies of The Blueprint for Survival back in the early 70s. He also wrote a book called The Stable Society. And what he means by stable is sustainable. Like, he took a look at the last 400 or 500 years of anthropological evidence in terms of what makes the difference between sustainable cultures and unsustainable cultures. Hang on just a second. I got to find my power cord because my computer is telling me I'm going to run out of battery momentarily. There we go. Okay. And then his magnum opus was The Way, that he worked on for almost 40 years, was The Way, an ecological worldview. And what Teddy Goldsmith identifies is really the major distinctions between sustainable and unsustainable cultures, and the vital, necessary role that religion or lifeways plays in that. And so I won't, maybe later we can go into more details, but I just want to mention that because part of my own sense of my legacy work is to frame religious language, that is language of reverence and language of condemnation. And religion needs to use both, because in sustainable cultures, good is identified with everything that's pro-future, everything that's a blessing or a contribution to the future, and a blessing to the larger body of life upon which we depend. And bad or evil or demonic is identified with that which is harmful to the future, that which is condemns the future, that which destroys the body of life upon which we depend. And so if religion is all about beliefism, which it's been for the last several thousand years, for some very understandable reasons. I mean, one of the books that had a huge difference in my life is called The Green History of Religion, which takes a look at the axial age, the last 2,500 years, and why the great religious traditions of the last 2,500 years, which most of us think about when we even think of the word religion, are so otherworldly oriented and so transcendent oriented. Well, when you understand what the environment, what the primary reality, what the climate, for example, was doing for the last 7,000 years prior to the emergence of these religions, well then, it becomes obvious that these religions would be otherworldly and transcendent oriented, because they each emerged in a culture that was already so radically human-centered and so radically unsustainable that there was no way that that religion could ensure accountability to the future. So the best it could do, it couldn't be the control mechanism, and that's Teddy Goldsmith's language, that religion is the control mechanism of stable, sustainable societies. But religion had been reduced to the coping mechanism of unsustainable cultures. So religion is the control mechanism, and mechanism simply in cybernetics, system cybernetics terms. That is that element of society that ensures constraints are honored, or ensures that limits are considered sacred. So the control mechanism of stable, sustainable cultures, and religion is the coping mechanism of unsustainable, human-centered cultures, anthropocentric rather than ecocentric. So a lot of my work is really reframing the core of religion, like the ecological and evolutionary purpose of religion, but also the religious necessity of science, that religion can't do what it needs to do, especially in today's age, if science, that is global collective intelligence, the entire worldwide empirical evidential tradition, doesn't provide the religious voices with what they need in terms of our best understanding of reality, and I use the word God and reality interchangeably. God is a mythic name or a personification of reality, reality with a personality. And reality is a secular name for what the ancients referred to as God. So we need to live in right relationship to reality, just like any other species, or we go extinct. And we need science to tell us what the nature of reality is. And then we need the religious, ethical, moral voices to proclaim to the culture and to the governments and to corporations and to the banking system, that is our ways of everything that facilitates the exchange of goods and services, that the only sustainable option is to mimic the laws of ecology. Religion has to have ecology at the heart. That's why I say religion or ecology must be the heart of theology, and ecology has to be the soul of economics. That is, it has to be the core, that our ways of exchanging goods and services must mimic the laws of ecology. For example, conserving energy to the max and recycling materials to the max. That's what old growth forests do. So it's really taking as a basis primary reality, the biosphere, as our core religious responsibility, and science as our core means of the collective intelligence to help us know what the nature of reality is that we're trying to live in right relationship to.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that great brief summary, and I so appreciate that. And I'm assuming that anybody who's watching this podcast that has that particular interest will find their way to your website. I'll be sure to put all the links you talk about in those show notes. With your permission, I'd like to just jump into the mud puddle right in the center of what you were just talking about. Mud puddle.
Sure, but 1 second, let me just say, for everybody watching this,
yeah.
If you go to thegreatstory.org, our main website, and you just click on what's new, it's also a chronological archive, but what's new, you'll see all the best sermons that I've produced, and basically anything that Connie and I produce that we really love. We put on that page, what's new. So all of my best sermons, chronologically oriented, and you'll see that the last half dozen or so sermons are all about what we've just been talking about. So anybody can do that. And they're all, again, freely available on YouTube, but you can access them easily from the What's New page of our The Great Story website.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So I'd like to just go to the distinction you're just talking about, that ideally religion is the control mechanism in a functioning, sustainability focused society. And what it's instead turned into, if I'm recounting right, is a coping mechanism for within an unsustainable society. And I'd like to just dive into some places that I just carry these really kind of dark questions that I have no idea how to answer them. And I have quite a few conversations with folks that are kind enough to explore difficult conversations with me. There's an awful lot about established religion, especially religion in the United States. And one sect that I particularly cannot get my head around is many of the evangelical folks that I hear about in the news or I meet and have conversations with. There are times when I'm just literally, my head explodes trying to understand how the level of cognitive dissonance can be held in a person's experience and in their mind as they carry out living their faith, which is, for many people, that's the center of their world. And I try and understand that from the center of my world, and literally the cognitive dissonance just has a tearing action in my brain. I can't hold it. So it seems like more than just a coping mechanism, that there a whole structure of story fragments have been kind of stuck together to justify what looks to me like a pedal to the metal, go as fast as we can to destroying this planet, backing all the military we can possibly muster in this country, and propping up leaders that have not just no integrity, but actually are extraordinarily destructive to the social contract that I think, I remember it was a quaint thing that was there when I was a kid, but it just seems like it's gone. And so I'm wondering, is there another term that you might use besides just coping that's going on in those things? And is there any sense that you can help me make of any of the things I've just shared?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, first of all, I'm really grateful for the fact that I have experienced personally, meaningfully, inspiringly, a lot of different worldviews. I was raised Roman Catholic. I had a born-again experience in my teenage years, coming out of real struggles with drugs and alcohol, and was involved in Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical, Bible-believing, fundamentalist Christianity for 5 years. Went to an evangelical college, actually an Assemblies of God college in Springfield, Missouri. And then went to an American Baptist seminary and ended up pastoring 3 churches. At my third church, actually prior to that, I started getting into Native American spirituality and sort of goddess, neo-pagans kind of stuff. So, and have had a real deep nourishment from Buddhism. I spent a week with Thich Nhat Hanh back in the mid-90s. I've done a Vipassana meditation. I've experienced a number, and Taoism is a huge piece of my own sort of world. Taoism, of course, being sort of the philosophy of life patterned on the rhythms and patterns of nature, the way nature works. What Teddy Goldsmith calls the way of life. And so what the evangelical holds as near and dear, I know what sustains it. And yes, of course, it's more than a coping mechanism. But a lot of rational, scientific-oriented, secular people don't understand what our best science and rationality tell us about the role of religion. That religions, there's a distinction. David Sloan Wilson is probably the leading evolutionary theorist on the planet. The three most highly regarded evolutionary theorists are David Sloan Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, and Richard Dawkins. But David's published more and done more than anybody in really helping us understand, as Edward O. Wilson has too, the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious significance of science. And David has a distinction between practical truth and factual truth. Religious beliefs, again, we've only been in this realm of beliefism, that religion has been about beliefs for maybe 3,000 years. Prior to that, religion was about experience and our experience of reality, and it was really about knowing about how to live in right relationship to reality. But once we start getting into religious beliefs, which only emerge once we start having writing, and we could talk about how writing shifts consciousness from oral cultures to literate cultures, but that's beside the point at this point. Religion is really about, if you act as if religious beliefs are real, are true, you'll experience personal wholeness and social coherence. Now, in sustainable cultures, you also experience ecological integrity, but that began dropping out in the last several thousand years. So it was really mostly about personal wholeness and social coherence, because these religions emerged in cultures where they were already out of relationship in terms of ecological. So they couldn't do anything with that. So that's what I meant. They tried to help people cope in a city-based civilization that was detrimental to the living world. So almost any religion, if you believe its beliefs, literally, you'll experience personal wholeness and social coherence. And they do that really well. And so we're in a situation now where, for example, when I believed, as I did at one time, that Jesus was coming down, and I interpreted that in a very literal sense. I read the Bible straight through twice. I was anti-evolution only for about a year and a half or so. But I understand why it is that the evangelical fundamentalist worldview appeals to people in terms of emotionality and their sense of why they struggle. I mean, for example, in 2012, I did a TEDx talk in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is a very conservative part of the world. And the title of the talk was "Why We Struggle and Suffer." It was all about, I think it was titled "Why We Struggle Now" or something like that. But it was really why we struggle and suffer, why we get addicted, why our kids and grandkids struggle with addiction and get tempted and distracted. And it was all about evolutionary psychology and brain science. It was all the same stuff that Connie found and uploaded to our website yesterday in terms of the evolutionize your life stuff. And I had 3 people, evangelicals, come up to me independently over a period of about 2 hours that evening during the social event. And all 3 of them said roughly the same thing, which was, I was a young earth creationist until I heard your talk. Now I've got to accept evolution. I've just got to do it in a God-honoring way. And one young man, he was probably in his mid-20s would be my guess, he said, I always thought that evolution was about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to live a more Christ-like life and have healthier relationships. And so a religious evangelical worldview helps people cope with challenging times. It gives them a sense of confidence that they've got the truth. It helps them live with a relationship to their own addictive instincts or their own mismatched instincts, really is a better way to talk about it. But there's a cognitive dissonance that goes deep, just as you said, and there's now a gulf, there's like a Grand Canyon in the evangelical world between those over 40 and those under 30, or under 40. Many of the younger evangelicals, A, they don't have an issue with science. B, they certainly don't have an issue with evolution. They don't have an issue with gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And they are largely repulsed by their parents and grandparents' unthinking support of Trump. so there's that gulf there. But again, I don't fault them, because until we who embrace a scientific, ecological, evolutionary worldview have gotten a hell of a lot better at communicating the inspirational side of that and the practical side of it. That's why my TEDx talk, why these evangelicals came up to me and talked to me, is because I was offering the practical side of an evolutionary worldview. That is how an evolutionary understanding, and when I use evangelical language, I'd say how what God has been revealing to us through facts about our unchosen nature. I mean, any young man that thinks the reason he's tempted by internet porn is because his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple is going to be clueless about how to live in Christ, that is, in integrity. Mm-hmm. And so what I was trying to offer in that presentation, and when I speak on that topic, is that that when we understand what God, what reality has revealed through evidence about our mismatched instincts and the fact that we live surrounded by supernormal stimuli, that is, things that we're evolutionarily programmed to pay attention to and want, but now in concentrations and dosages more intense than any of our ancestors had to deal with, we're going to experience problems. So I put the onus of responsibility on religious, on we science-oriented and ecologically and evolutionary-oriented people to find ever more inspiring ways to talk about this stuff. Because when we do, in my experience, I used to be an anti-evolutionary fundamentalist. I used to be a biblical literalist. And I have a far more joyous relationship to God, to reality, and less fear. And I'm less troubled by my mismatched instincts as a result of having an ecological evolutionary interpretation of the gospel. That is the good news. And an ecological interpretation of religion in general.
Yeah, if I could, I'm almost done with my dark question, and I appreciate your going at it with me. I'm wondering if you would share what you see when you look out and see kind of the current state of affairs, the proportion, if you will, of folks who are in the evangelical camp that you've just been talking about, on the side that has not come to your understanding. I'm just wondering how does it look out there? You know, when I look out there, is because I don't know anything except what I see in various articles that I see and the very few conversations I have. But to me, it doesn't look good in a number of ways. And right now we're just talking about this one slice of America in particular flavor of religious experience. And when I look there, it looks like it's got its thumb on the scales in a negative way.
Well, of course it does.
How does it look to you?
Yeah, of course it does. But that's what happens in the collapse of every known civilization that we have evidence for. I mean, this is the thing. In February, mid-February, I think it was February 19th, the BBC published an article, a special series on deep civilization. And it was an article by Luke Kemp called, "Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse?" And of course he answered yes. And then he had a chart that listed 88 civilizations between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. So during that 4,000 year period from 3000 BCE, which was 5,000 years ago, to 1,000 years ago, he listed 88 civilizations and how long they lasted and, you know, where in the world they were and what they died of, or, you know, listed sort of the 5 or 6 major reasons why civilizations collapsed. And it's an excellent article. And John Michael Greer, I mean, there are some people like Arnold Toynbee and Spengler, Vico, who spent careers, lifetimes, basically, you know, setting civilizations side by side and noticing the common patterns of contraction and collapse. And it turns out that we're right on schedule. I mean, we are not contracting in any abnormal way. And the fact is that that's one of the reasons why most religions don't survive the collapse of civilizations and the dark age in between that and whatever culture or civilization emerges on the other side after the rubble stops bouncing, is because the people of that tradition say, hey, your religion, the grandkids of, those who were the leaders say, hey, your religion, our religion didn't do anything to spare us this hell that we've had to live with. And so they search for other meaning-making systems. And that's what religions are, is meaning-making systems. They're interpretive worldviews that help us in symbolic language live in a way that is that fosters personal wholeness, social coherence, and ideally ecological integrity. And in sustainable cultures, the order is reversed. Ecological integrity is first, and then social coherence, and then personal wholeness. And so that's the only thing that can do that is religion. And so I don't fault fundamentalists, I don't fault evangelicals, because we tend to be doing what civilizations do in their contracting phase. And I see that as inevitable. But I also see it as rich with opportunity to have compassion. And so in my main program, one of the slides that I show in my main evening program, many people tell me is their favorite slide of my entire 100 or so slides that I show. And it's a slide that simply says at the top, especially deserving of compassion and generosity. And I suggest that these 6 groups are especially deserving of compassion and generosity. I'll just read them. Poor people, communities, and nations who will suffer the most from climate and ecological breakdowns, yet who contributed the least to its main causes. We can all get that. Also deserving of compassion and generosity, those of us feeling the loneliness of having to navigate our own downshifting expectations whilst family, friends, and maybe even spouses are in denial. Individuals, couples, children, families, and communities of our fellow social and mammalian species who generally feel and suffer just like we do. Techno-optimists, and I emphasize this, I believe these are deserving of compassion and generosity. Techno-optimists and free market fundamentalists who will remain in denial the longest and be hardest hit emotionally and financially when reality bites. Religious, political, and social liberals and progressives whose faith in the religion of perpetual progress is currently being shaken, shattered, or abandoned. And finally, I believe deserving of compassion and generosity are religious conservatives and evangelicals whose faith in the Bible has blinded them to what God, reality, has revealed through facts about our inner, outer, social, and moral nature, and who thus struggle disproportionately with addiction, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, depression, suicide, and sin in general. So I am as troubled as you are, but I also think that for those of us who get it, those of us who get the big picture, we can step into our own bigness by having compassion and generosity rather than yang judgment toward those who are really just doing what humans do in groups, and we see it over and over again in previous contracting civilizations.
Spectacular list. The longer we talk, the more I'm thinking that I'll just include the link to this conversation in one of the later episodes of this series that you and I are going to be a part of this week.
Well, if anybody watching this or listening to this has a desire to share these ideas with others and discuss them specifically, I was working with an organization called Living the Questions, which has been the main producer of radical and liberal, progressive, religious educational materials, mostly Christian churches, but Unitarian Universalists as well. And they just came out literally on Earth Day, like last week, they came out with a course of mine, which is 8 20-minute sessions. So each session is 20 minutes long, but it has questions for reflection and discussion. It's designed for church and secular and synagogue study groups, but it's called Pro Future Faith. So if you just put profuturefaith.org, you'll get to the Living the Questions Pro Future Faith course of mine. And it's specifically designed for facilitating discussion groups in people's living rooms or in houses of worship or secular settings, but specifically in terms of groups to discuss this stuff and then you support each other in taking action beyond that.
That's great. That is just great. Well, we will definitely include that for the folks that are joining us in this upcoming series as well, Michael. You know, I can feel the window of our time in this particular interview starting to close, and I'm you know, there's a quietness that's settling in after you've said what you've said and shared so generously, and you've helped me to kind of hold up for my own view while you were touring us on the historical path you've been walking, and I've been holding mine up, you know, next to yours as you've been talking, and just looking and feeling at what's it been like to be in this particular time. Both you and I we're pretty close in age, and literally we have been at the center of the exponential rise of our fall. You know,
Yeah,
all the pieces that have come together, good, bad, and indifferent, that have added up to our now having to face the collapse of Earth and human systems.
well,
We
this,
have
yeah,
been, sorry, go
let
ahead.
me just quick jump on something there before you go on to whatever else you were going to say, and I apologize for interrupting. But one of the things that I regularly share with audiences, and I find nourishment myself in just pondering and reflecting on, is the fact that, again, when you set these different cultures and civilizations side by side and you discover the common patterns in contraction, it turns out that from an emotional standpoint, the most difficult time to be alive is when you were born into a society or a culture or civilization that is still in its expansive phase. So its carrying capacity, to use William Catton's ecological language, in carrying capacity surplus, where there's more than enough energy, more than enough resources, and the pie is expanding economies. And so when a group of people are born into that, and in their lifetime, it shifts to carrying capacity deficit, where there's not enough energy, not enough resources, where the ecological devastation, overshoot, is so pronounced that it begins to impact deleteriously the quality of life. And so there's contracting expectations, contracting possibilities, and in expanding economies and times of carrying capacity surplus, liberal values, progressive values tend to predominate. And in contracting times, contracting civilizations, collapsing, because collapse usually takes many, many, many decades and there's partial recoveries. But in collapsing civilizations and contracting times, contracting economies, conservative values tend to predominate. Mm-hmm. And the most difficult time emotionally is when you're born into expanding possibilities, and in your lifetime it shifts, and now you're living in contracting possibilities. Because people who are born into contraction, and that's all they've ever known, that's just the reality. Mm-hmm. And so you and I have been alive. I'm 60 years old now, and we've been alive. We were born into that, and here's where we are now. And
yeah,
you know, there's no need bemoaning that. It's just what's real. But those of us who get that, I think, get to play a role, and it is a sacred role, in my opinion, of helping our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors, our family, who come to the party late. That is, they become aware of contraction, they become aware of overshoot, they can become aware of climate chaos and global weirding, they become aware of the more than just challenges on the horizon, but the really scary ass challenges, the terrifying challenges on the and we get to help them process that, because we're all going to have to deal with this Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, and we're not going to deal with it once. We're going to cycle back again and again. But ultimately, many of us come to that place that Paul Trafurka speaks about in terms of finding the gift. And so, anyway, I forget where I was going with that, but I just wanted to mention that emotional time for those of us that were born into expansion, and in our life it changes. And so that, again, we can have compassion for ourselves and each other.
Yeah. I guess what I would say, just to wrap it up from my side of this conversation, I can't imagine a better way to couch an exploration of this new term, this Jem Bendel's term of deep adaptation, because really, when I look under the hood, so to speak, of that term, that's really what you've been working on your entire life, because that's
Well, not my entire life. It wasn't between 2000 and 2012. I was still really in, Paul Trafurka outlines 5 stages of awakening. The first is complete denial, dead asleep. Awareness of one fundamental problem, awareness of many problems, awareness of the interconnections between the many problems, and awareness that our predicament encompasses all aspects of life. Right. And so I was really in denial. I was dead asleep from 2000 to 2012. And then pretty much in 2012, December, I became aware of climate change. 2013, lots of problems. 2014, the interconnections between the lots of problems. And 2015, I read William Catton's book, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change, which is the single most important book I've ever read in my life. Connie, my wife, feels the same way. And now we've been aware of the predicament. And so, yes, Jem Bendel and the whole approach to deep adaptation, that we need, the sooner that we can collectively and individually, but the sooner we can collectively accept that the extinction of Homo colossus is inevitable. There is no way to avoid the contraction and ultimate collapse of society. So societal collapse is inevitable. The catastrophe and really big problems are really, really likely. And the extinction of our species is possible. The sooner we get our hearts and heads around that, then we can be engaged from a much more heartful, compassionate, generous, on purpose, fearless place. And as Jem Bendel rightly points out, most of the people he talks to, and most of the people I talk to as well in this regard, when they accept the inevitable collapse of society, when they accept that the near-term extinction of Homo colossus, they're not less inclined to be engaged in activism. They're more inclined, but it's now from a fearless, heartful place, and with the desire to look ourselves in the mirror, knowing that we've done our part, that we've done what we could to be faithful to the future in a society that's collapsing precisely because it has not been faithful to the future.
Yeah. Well said. Well, Michael Dowd, thank you again for your many, many gifts to all of us. And I invite the people who have just been hearing about you for the first time to dive into the links that I'll be including in the show notes, all the ones that Michael's been listing out for us this entire interview. I just am thrilled that you're going to be joining us in this upcoming series. This is May, June, July of 2019 that we're talking about, and it'll be posted in recording form for people who are listening to this after that. I feel like there's a sweetness and a strength and a groundedness that comes every time I get to hear you lay out what it looks like from your perspective, and consider you absolutely a brother and an ally on the path. And I just thank you both so much for your generous giving to the community at large for so long. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean. And I, too, consider you a close brother and colleague in this work. The only resource that I can think of that I haven't mentioned, in addition to the website, thegreatstory.org, and everything that's linked from there is my YouTube channel, Reverend Reality. I have a YouTube channel called Reverend Reality. And so there's lots of stuff available from there as well.
All right. Just jotting that down.
Yeah, I'll send you via email the links so that you can post them in the.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Thank you. Anything else, Michael?
Looking forward to this next few months in this conversation that you're facilitating. Greatly appreciate you for that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Enjoy this gorgeous day.
Okay. Thank you, Dean. Take care, brother.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.